I was a lawyer, or if I was a white person working in a more white organization, a non-Muslim organization such as Amnesty International, would I be subjected to the same level of assumption, scrutiny, name calling? As soon as someone is accused of terrorism, leave alone terrorism, if you're accused of being a sympathizer to terrorists, that's it. I mean, your reputation is finished.
How far would you go to protect your sources? Would you face the government? Would you face prison? For a UK human rights advocate, this was a reality he found himself in when he refused to turn over the passwords to his devices while being searched and questioned at Heathrow Airport. Then, a year later, he was tried and convicted as a terrorist. Welcome to The Big Picture, a show about the past, the present, and the future. My name is Muhammad Hassan, and today we sit down with Muhammad Rabbani, the managing director of the Cage Advocacy Group and the subject of the new documentary film, The Phantom Parrot. The film premiered at the Sheffield Documentary Festival in June and chronicles Rabbani's fight through the UK courts, attempting to clear his name and protect his clients. Despite being a prominent human rights advocate whose work involves dealing with victims of unlawful detention and torture, victims with highly sensitive information, he was stopped repeatedly at the border and asked to hand over the passwords to his devices under the controversial Schedule 7 clause in the UK's Terrorism Act, passed in the year 2000. So why did he refuse? And what does this case mean for the rest of us? Thank you for being with us. Welcome to The Big Picture.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
This film, Phantom Parrot, chronicles essentially 5 to 6 years of your life that began with your arrest in 2017 at London's Heathrow Airport. What happened that day?
Yes, so it was actually 2016. I was coming back from an investigation trip on behalf of my organization, Cage. We were looking into the case of a Qatari national who had alleged that he had been tortured at the hands of FBI agents whilst he was in prison in the US. So in the course of that investigation, we gathered a lot of evidence through his lawyers and were building up a case to seek accountability for the torture that he'd faced at the hands of the Americans. So once I'd collected all of that material and I was on my way back to the UK, I had with me my laptop, my devices, my phone, and a few USBs and things. Upon landing at Heathrow Airport, I was apprehended by counter-terrorism police, and they used a power which exists only at UK borders called Schedule 7. It's under the Terrorism Act 2000. And using those powers, they tried to coerce me to not only just give up my devices, but also hand over the passwords to my devices. That would have then enabled them to access the material, the evidence that I just mentioned. So I felt that I had no choice but to refuse on the basis of principle, that it is, I have to protect the confidentiality of a torture survivor, and also on the basis that as a human rights defender, someone working with vulnerable people, I do have protections under the law, and the police were abusing their power. So I refused. I was then arrested, and ultimately that then went to court. I was charged for a terrorist offence, and then finally that ended up in court where I was convicted actually a few months down the line. Mm-hmm. So I think the police, in a way, were not to blame, but rather it drew attention to the fact that there's a law that exists in the UK which parliamentarians have approved many years ago, and police were abusing their power under this law.
So, as you mentioned in the film, this was a recurring incident for you. This is something that you had come to almost expect when flying back from assignments or just generally flying back to the UK, and that there had been several times where you had been asked to hand over your passwords and refused, and then consequently been released. What do you think was different about this particular incident that not only led to your arrest, but ultimately your conviction?
I think it's going to be hard for me to prove it, but looking at the circumstances and looking at the stakes that were involved in this particular case, I mean, we were in possession of US prison logs. These are documents that were produced by US prison authorities, and on those documents we had actual names of FBI agents who were in the room, there were notes on what measures or techniques they were using, what sorts of questions they were asking of this victim. His name is Ali Al-Marri. So I feel that this was a targeted stop, and it was deliberate, and it was at the behest of the US authorities. And hence, yes, as you mentioned, in the past, maybe, upon reasoning with the police, I refused my passwords and they agreed. On this case, they just wouldn't agree. They were adamant, they were determined to get hold of the material. And as a result, they used the force of the law to coerce me. I still felt compelled to not surrender my passwords.
Why didn't you surrender your passwords? I mean, I guess it's a question that, I guess within the spirit of this particular law, it would be set up to allow, border security, counterterrorism officials to be able to identify certain activity that might be suspicious, protect, UK borders. And so in that situation, you as somebody who is a human rights advocate who works with these clients, you have a decision. Once you get to this situation, you're faced with police officers or counterterrorism officials, and they're asking you to hand over passwords. Why do you choose not to do that?
It's primarily a matter of principle, okay? And what is that principle? It's a matter of integrity. If someone has entrusted me with confidential information, I cannot surrender that information without their consent. In a sense, it's very common sense. Everyone will understand that. Even if those police officers found themselves in my position and someone was forcing them to hand over their password, they wouldn't hand it over. Even the judge who convicted me, if she was in the same position as I am, and some police officers tried to forcibly access her laptop or get hold of documents that she was in the possession of, she wouldn't hand it over because she would cite data protection, she would cite professional confidentiality. And so that's the main reason. And secondly, there is a broader concern around privacy. We are in an increasingly surveilled lifestyle. I mean, because technology and just the digital world and the real world is very much blended these days. So I think the law just hasn't caught up with all of that. So I was asserting also privacy rights, that there should be a scope, and that scope has not been adequately defined in law. When these laws were drafted, you're going back to the year 2000. There were no smartphones. There was no there was no social media. There was none of this stuff. So people were maybe, traveling through the airports. Maybe they had documents with them. Maybe they had a briefcase or something like that. But nowadays, because pretty much everything that we possess is all digitized, so there's that point as well. And I felt that I had to take a stand. I think the final reason is I am the head of a important organization which specializes in defending the rights of and advocating for due process in the cases of people who've been wrongfully often accused of terrorism. So I felt that as a representative of that organization, I couldn't at all damage the trust of vulnerable people who come and access our services. So CAGE as an organization has been doing this work for 20 years now. So just because some police officers were threatening me or intimidating me, I couldn't just give in to that.
And this is relating to what you mentioned before, Section 7 of the Terrorism Act. And Section 7 is something that has kind of become shorthand among people in the advocacy scene, certainly within certain sectors of the Muslim community here, it is notorious. But outside of that, I imagine that it's maybe something that is alien to a large number of people here in the UK. What is the legacy of Section 7, and what has the government been using it in effect to do?
Well, Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act is a power that has been in operation since the year 2000. So it actually goes before, the events of 9/11, the events of 7/7. And what this power does is it's an extraordinary broad power. The power allows UK border police to essentially imprison a person for up to 6 hours without accusing them of a crime, let alone having evidence against them, let alone bringing charges against them in any formal process, legal process. They simply have been granted the power that upon suspicion, I was about to say suspicion, but it's not suspicion. Mm-hmm. They do not have to have suspicion. It's a suspicion-less power. So, it makes you wonder on what basis do they stop people, right? Normally, if police intrude upon your rights as an individual, they have to have a reason. Mm. And that reason has to reach a threshold, which is minimum suspicion. Like, I suspect that you might be involved in a crime. Then that gives me, the police officer, the right and authority, legitimacy to intrude upon your freedoms, your liberty. What Schedule 7, the way it works is it doesn't require suspicion. Mm. So once you've done away with that, it means every single person who is stopped is presumed guilty until, through the interrogation of 6 hours, they can satisfy the police officer that they're innocent. So under the regime, a police officer can detain you for 6 hours and question you anything, ask you any questions within that time. You do not have the right to remain silent. So you cannot say, I'm unsure, I don't want to answer, I need to take legal advice. You can't say any of that. You have to answer. If you don't answer, it's a criminal offense that can get you arrested. Your DNA can be taken forcibly from you. Your fingerprints can be taken forcibly from you. You can be strip searched. All of the belongings that you have can be confiscated, particularly your devices, which contain all of your data. That can be retained, that can be copied. And remember, all of this without at any point you being accused of a crime. Okay? So Cage actually commissioned a report. We published a report in 2019 on the operation of Schedule 7 and how it actually impacts people. So in that report, we found that around 500,000 people since 2009 have been affected by Schedule 7. They've been stopped. So it's not a small number. It's a lot of people. Before 2009, i.e. between 2000 and 2009, during which the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, 7/7 attacks, various events occurred. We don't have any data because the government actually hasn't released that data. And we think the numbers would be upwards of 1 million probably. So we're talking about a lot of people who have been violated, treated like criminals. They've been made to feel as though they are guilty. For what? What's the reason then? I mean, your question was like, why do the authorities do this? And in a nutshell, they're doing it because it's a tool of mass intelligence gathering. It enables border police to, over time, gain a very detailed picture of a particular demographic that they are interested in this case, the Muslim population of Britain.
And this is kind of the crux of the issue, is that it's not necessarily everybody that is randomly going through Schedule 7 and being pulled aside. You're saying it's a particular demographic of people that have been adversely affected by it.
According to a study done by Cambridge University, the figures are something like 80% of the people who are stopped are of Muslim background. Okay. Now, I would love to say that the official statistics also confirm that. However, the Home Office, when it releases figures, it refuses to acknowledge the ethnic or religious background of the people it stops. I say refuses because I know with certainty that that data is collected. How do I know? Because in each of the times when I've been stopped and interrogated, let alone all the hundreds of people who've come through Cage's door who've reported on their stops, I can tell you as an eyewitness, there's a form that the police officers place in front of you. They collect your details, and amongst the things that they collect is, what ethnic background, what religion, and I've verbally answered, I follow the religion of Islam. So I know that data is being collected, but it's being deliberately suppressed. Why? Because, again, going with the theory that it is very, very deliberately seeking to profile an entire community. So Schedule 7 powers, not only are they a gross violation of due process norms, they're also a racist and Islamophobic tool. It's an institutional form of Islamophobia that is operating in Britain.
Outside the realm of border security, in everyday life, in the real world, what would it take for a police officer to be able to ask you to hand over your devices and passwords to your devices? Do they have the power to do that normally?
That's one of the best ways to explain just how draconian Schedule 7 powers are. Often when people have asked in the past, I've explained that if I was accused of murder, like on British soil, and a police officer wanted to arrest me in the process of investigating that murder, I would have far more rights and protections than an innocent person just flying back from a holiday, or maybe Hajj, or maybe, a work trip back to the UK, back home. My rights in the two situations are totally, starkly different. So under Schedule 7, there's forget about accusation. I mean, forget about evidence. There's no evidence. There's no accusation even. Whereas if I was accused of a murder here, the police would still have to arrest me. They would have to give me my right to remain silent. I'd have access to a lawyer, okay? And they couldn't just take my devices. They would have to take me to the police station. They'd have to process me and book me in. Even at that point, I can still assert that even if they confiscate my devices, they can't access them, okay? So, i.e., there are protections available, because this is actually the way the law is meant to operate, that a person should be assumed innocent. And if their rights and liberties are deprived, there has to be a proper accountable process. So what the UK government has done in a very clever or devious way has set up a regime which operates only at UK borders, and it's exceptional. This sort of regime does not exist in any Western nation, anywhere in Europe, anywhere in the world actually. I mean, the closest is the Americans, but even then, it's not the same as Schedule 7. And interestingly, I think it's worth mentioning, the people who are stopped under Schedule 7 powers are actually British nationals. They're not foreigners. So one might think, it's a power that's used to stop foreigners coming and harming the UK. It's not used against foreigners. It's used against British nationals. So that means it is designed to surveil, collect information, profile a section of the British population. If this type of profiling program was in operation against any other section of British population, there would be an outcry, there would be outrage. But I think, over 20 years, the Muslim community has been subjected to this primarily. Not to say others haven't. You will come across some cases now and again involving non-Muslim people, and it shouldn't be done against anyone. But I do feel it's been deliberately targeted against the Muslim community as an exercise of mass intelligence gathering.
This judgment, based on the judges and prosecution's acceptance, I am of good character, worthy of belief, highlights the absurdity of Schedule 7 law. They accept that at no point was I under suspicion, and that ultimately this was a matter of having been profiled at court. There are important implications for our collective privacy as Schedule 7 acts as a digital strip search. I took the decision to not raise the details of an important torture case before my arrest. Ultimately, I have been convicted of protecting the confidentiality of my client. If privacy and confidentiality are crimes, then the law stands condemned. Cage and I are glad we brought this case, and the result indicates that our only option is to change the law. Schedule 7 actively discriminates, and this will hopefully be the start of a number of legal challenges as more people take courage to come forward.
Schedule 7 is part of a larger legacy of the war on terror over the last 20 years, as you mentioned. Sweeping wave of laws and procedures that were put in place, not just by the UK government, but a lot of other governments around the world. Specifically, I think of the Five Eyes alliance between Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the US, Canada, in terms of their ability to kind of bring their counterintelligence laws closer together, but also allow for that sharing of information. And you mentioned, the fact that you believe that the evidence that you had in your case relating to the FBI, a UK ally, could be the reason why this search was done. Mm-hmm. So do you feel like part of Schedule 7 and its uses is as an intelligence gathering tool, not just for the UK, but for UK allies?
Mm-hmm. I don't feel that. I mean, it's actually proven through, the documentary goes into this actually. The name is taken from a program called Phantom Parrot, and that program exists to collect all this information and share it. Share it with whom? So it's collected, firstly, it's shared to an agency called GCHQ, which is the main information or digital surveillance agency in the UK. And then through the Five Eyes partnership, it goes to places like the NSA in the US and the other partners. So it's actually there, documented, that this is why it exists. And we have to credit Edward Snowden, because of what he revealed 10 years ago. This information came to light. So if you, The Intercept did a couple of stories on this. So viewers can just look it up there, and they can find the documents. So it's just, I think it's the new world that we now live in, where digital surveillance is a massive part of our lives, whether it's corporate digital surveillance, whether it's government digital surveillance, and without proper scrutiny and accountability, these powers are just growing. So I know you referred to it as a legacy of the war on terror. It's not, I wouldn't phrase it like that myself, because the war on terror is very much active. In fact, we're talking about Schedule 7. Only 2 years ago, actually last year, the government expanded the powers. It changed the provisions under the law to now include even more wider range of targets. So now they've included anyone arriving into the UK on a vessel can be subjected to the exact same powers.
Which effectively includes refugees and undocumented migrants.
Absolutely. Those people who are fleeing war and persecution, the way that the UK will now welcome them is that there are terrorism suspects. Okay? So that's a gross violation. And secondly, they've also now added a provision where those asylum seekers who are brought into the UK and they are placed in detention centres, whilst they're in those detention centres for a period of, I think, 5 or 6 days, at any point, these powers can be used against them. So it's not even 6 hours, okay? So what you see is, rather than a rollback, you're seeing an expansion and a growth of the surveillance capabilities of the UK government.
If you were to play devil's advocate and put yourself in the government's shoes, their justification is that they need the strongest tools possible in order to protect their borders from potential threats. What is it that Schedule 7 allows the government to do that it can't do without it?
I mean, I'm going to come to that part of your question in a minute. I think the easiest way to understand what it does and what the government claims it's doing is to look at the facts, to look at the evidence. If you look at the evidence, I'll give you two important statistics. In the year that I was stopped, which was 2016, along with me, 19,000 other people were stopped. Okay, so if we go with the theory that this is designed to actually stop terrorists from coming to the UK and to investigate possible terrorist plots, what you would expect is from these 19,000 people, a huge number of them would be terrorists, and they'd be pursued in the courts, they'd be arrested, and then they'd be found guilty of the various plots that they're planning, right? Guess how many people were arrested from those 19,000?
Apart from yourself.
Apart from myself, how many?
How many?
Take a guess.
I don't know, 1,000.
Nowhere near. I mean, it was six.
6 people.
6 people.
Out of 19,000.
Out of 19,000 were charged with any sort of crime, right? I.e., they reached that point where there was some basis for actually thinking that this person has done something wrong. Okay, that means that they've been charged under the law. So I was one of them. So, and you know my crime, okay, it was nothing to do with terrorism. It was to do with protecting confidential information of a torture survivor. So now, those other few people who were charged, out of 19,000, gives you an idea of actually what are they looking for. If they were pursuing terrorists, you would have expected huge numbers of terrorists being apprehended, right? Another important statistic is I mentioned that in 2009, the data was being collected from that point until now. In our report, we listed a number of around 420,000 people in that period, right? Again, if I was to just say, look, 500,000 people were stopped, how many were charged? Take a guess.
I don't know. It's more than 6, maybe?
It's more than 6, 81. Of those 81, 40 were convicted of any form of crime. So now, just the maths tells you that 40 people, over a period of like 12, 13 years, out of a pool of 500,000 who had been stopped and investigated and interrogated and violated, only 40 people were convicted in a court of law. That translates into 99.997% of those people were innocent. So our question to the UK government would be, if you're looking for terrorists, where are they? Where are they? Like, you should be finding a whole bunch of them. Meanwhile, if you look on the other side, unfortunately you have incidents such as the Manchester bombings, where actually people died from planned acts of political violence. Salman Abedi was coming into the UK and going out of the UK, so I don't know what happened there. So all these questions remain, and which then leads us to the conclusion that this really is not about protecting national security. It's not really about stopping terrorist violence. It has a different purpose, and it's serving that purpose. And that's why parliamentarians, that's why Home Office officials are consistently backing this power, because they're quite satisfied with its purpose.
So I'm a New Zealand citizen, grew up in New Zealand, and a couple of years ago, I think 2017, 2018, when I was flying back home to see my family, I was stopped at the airport, and New Zealand doesn't quite have Schedule 7. It's not to the same extent, but there's a similar powers that allows border customs to stop people and ask them questions, and in my case also ask for their devices and passwords for devices. And my experience going through that, and I was stopped for about 3-4 hours, was scary. And I came out of it with two kind of experiences. One is that despite the fact that I was a journalist and that I covered similar stories before, in that situation, I really had no idea what my rights were. I had no idea whether I could refuse to have my personal devices taken or scanned, if I could refuse, if I had a right to speak to my parents that were waiting for me outside, that were calling me, and I was being told that I wasn't allowed to pick up my phone. I had no idea what I was allowed to refuse to and what the consequences for that were. And the second thing that I realized afterwards through that experience is that I don't think the people that were interrogating me knew what they were looking for. Is that a similar experience to not only yourself, but the large amount of people, mainly Muslim people, that your organization deals with?
Very much so. Very much so. I mean, people, in a way, they shouldn't have a reason to have all of this knowledge, because, I mean, why would you? I mean, you're just going for a holiday, or you're coming back home after a business trip, whatever it is. Why would you have to look up and research and memorize the number of a lawyer and everything else when you are coming back home? Okay, you should receive a welcome. You should feel feelings of, relief instead of anxiety. Okay, so that is very much the experience of the majority of the people who we speak to, who come through Cage's door. And yes, on the other side is true as well. I mean, the police officers, they just, when you get into a conversation with them, you realize that they don't really understand. And I said earlier on as well that I do regard the police are complicit, of course. They're implementing this power. It's an oppressive power, so they are accountable. However, I do feel that the main responsibility lies on parliamentarians. Parliamentarians put this power in place. It's a piece of legislation, and at the time when it was designed, there was no 9/11, there was nothing, and it kind of like points to how how concerning it is when lawmakers create laws, that they have to build in mechanisms of proportionality, necessity, accountability, and if they don't, and political circumstances change, the broadness of that law can then be abused, right? And this is what's happened in the UK or in Britain. It's no. I mean, the British people are familiar with the phenomenon of political violence, because for about 30 years, the troubles in Ireland and the effects of that in England and other places was part and parcel of life. At that time, parliamentarians did pass laws as well. But the way those laws were passed were always done in the sense that these are exceptional powers. We need them because it's an emergency, okay? And then we will review them every 6 months, every year, maybe every 2 years, okay? Something changed after 9/11 and the declaration of the war on terror. Something fundamentally changed. Parliamentarians just didn't feel the need to, scrutinize and review those things. And what is essentially an emergency power was then normalized into ordinary law. Okay? Now, members of the public didn't really feel any of that. Members of the public were led to believe that, this is absolutely necessary and we're constantly under terrorism threat. No doubt there was a threat. But of course, lawmakers and politicians and people in the Home Office, those who are seeking bigger budgets, they would constantly play up that threat. And as I mentioned with some of these statistics, the facts just don't add up. So what we now have is an emergency power which has now become totally normalized into law. Because it doesn't affect the majority population, no one really raises any concerns. And I don't see that changing, unfortunately. There will be odd cases now and again. You mentioned, you're a journalist, and there have been journalists who have been apprehended under Schedule 7. David Miranda is a famous case. More recently, in April, there was a French person, Ernest Moret, who was coming to London to attend a book fair. The police, because they have the power, they use the power. Was he a terrorism suspect? Not by any measure. But they apprehended him, they took his devices, they tried to force him to give the password. It's a very similar scenario. Because they have the power. So my point is that the responsibility really lies with Parliament, and therefore also lies with the British public. The British public empowered those parliamentarians to actually create that legislation, and it's being abused every single year.
Your experience strikes me as being particularly alarming, because the Schedule 7 is a provision under the Terrorism Act, and it's intended as a tool to help the government protect itself from terror suspects. You, as a human rights advocate, dealing with people that have been unfairly accused of terror offenses, now find yourself essentially convicted under this offense. You joke in the film that you're now a convicted terrorist, and there's a kind of irony there. What does that mean for you personally, but also for your ability to continue doing your job?
Personally, it's something, I mean, I've come to terms with now, but I must say, of course, I would wonder what are the implications. I am acutely aware of how the word terrorism is weaponized in public debate, how it is an emotionally charged, very politically sensitive term. As soon as someone is accused of terrorism, leave alone terrorism, if you're accused of being a sympathizer to terrorists, that's it. I mean, your reputation is finished. Anyone who does a Google search, they'll always find that you are a sympathizer to terrorism. The public debate has been manufactured in such a way that people have this irrational rejection, without really questioning, and you saw that happening, for example, when Jeremy Corbyn was being attacked by his opponents in media. They would bring this type of language, terrorist sympathizer, just to delegitimize him. So then, of course, then you have someone like me, who's of Muslim background, working in the human rights area, trying to defend people who are falsely accused of terrorism. And it's not like I've been labeled a terrorist. I have been convicted under terrorism law. So that does have consequences, And I think, I see both sides. I see that I can't shake that off, the negative around that. I mean, it will always be in the reporting. I mean, if you Google my name, you'll always find it there. So that will certainly narrow the prospects and possibilities of certain opportunities in the future. But I also see that I genuinely believe that I did the right thing, and I can't think of any other way to have evaded that. So long as I feel that, the morally correct thing, I pursued the morally correct option, I feel satisfied, okay? I think our community at large, the Muslim community, who have been falsely accused of terrorism, and demonized in the newspapers and in the media, they need to also hear a different story, So, in a way, we're just tired, and in a sense, it's meaningless. You see, so from one angle, it doesn't bother me at all. Actually, I get contentment from the fact that someone has accused me of terrorism, but it's meaningless. I'm still here. I'm still continuing the work that I'm doing. I still have, inshallah, good standing within my community, and Cage's work has actually grown from strength to strength. So I think that's another message we have to give to our community and also our detractors, that you can try to delegitimize us, you can try to intimidate us with these things, but it's not going to work.
What has this experience taught you about the kind of work that you do and the kind of work that you want to do in the future?
It's extremely difficult work, okay? But at the same time, very satisfying. It's necessary. I think I always reflect on the fact that if I was a lawyer, or if I was a white person working in a more white organization, a non-Muslim organization such as Amnesty International, would I be subjected to the same level of assumption, scrutiny, name calling? I think everyone knows the answer, okay? But because we are a grassroots organization from the targeted community itself, it comes with the terrain, okay? The problem isn't in the work that I do or the work that my organization does. The problem is in the public attitudes, which have been manufactured by, media barons and politicians. So, I mean, our work will continue to try to change that perception. Will we succeed? I don't know. I think when political circumstances change, and they inevitably will, as happens in history, everything doesn't stay the same. So we just sort of hold on to that and just continue doing the work, serve the community, advocate for justice, seek accountability for those torturers, those torturers in the case of Ali al-Marri included. I mean, they got away. But, we have this sense of belief that, one day the truth will catch up with them.
And finally, with releasing this film, with sharing your story, which is not an easy thing to speak about very publicly, what do you hope comes out of it? What do you hope happens specifically with Schedule 7?
Well, I think the most important thing is we just need to make more awareness about it, and that's the most important step. So what the film does, I think it's an amazing piece of work. It's very well produced. I think it will reach audiences, far beyond, those who maybe would normally become aware of these matters. So that's our hope, that it's going to really inform audiences. And secondly, will it lead to then change in terms of the law? I really can't say, but I do feel that it's going to make a huge, contribution in that direction. I do feel that the film also is going to be helpful in making people think generally around how they relate to their digital life, really. And hopefully it will make them more conscious of that they do need to set up boundaries so that personal privacy, professional privacy, they take care, and it's not just casually just allowing for a surveillance society to form. Okay, so I'm hopeful that the film does that, and I think it does it really well. It really draws attention to your own smartphone use. It draws attention to how much data is being collected by governments, but also corporations. And then thirdly and lastly, I feel the film will be a form of, how would I call it? I can't call it healing, but a form of acknowledgement, let's say, for people like Ali al-Marri, who've suffered, 12, 13 years unjustly in US prisons. There will be many other people like him, who've been put through torture, who've never had their side of the story told. So I feel that the film will soothe their hearts. And maybe, to a lesser extent, those people who've been violated by Schedule 7, I think also they'll feel, positive from seeing that their story, their concerns, their point of view is finally, being put across.
And this is your job to keep telling those stories.
Yeah, we hope to continue. I mean, as I mentioned, every single day, or every single week at least, there are still cases where Cage is still having to deal with, where people are calling us, they've been picked up somewhere, family members have been disappeared, really serious cases like that, but also Schedule 7. People are still being stopped, and their rights are being taken away unjustly. So we'll continue to do that.
Muhammad Rabbani, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture. Thank you to Muhammad Rabbani for being our guest today. Please share your thoughts on how you feel about Section 7, about border security, and about these laws that are impacting not all of us, but maybe some of us. You can also watch the documentary The Phantom Parrot once it's released for public viewing in the UK. As always, you can find all of our episodes here on YouTube, but also on all of our podcast platforms, wherever you get your podcasts. Please subscribe, please share, and until next time, salam.